Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Juan's World, and today I'm going to go through the steps to make a Christmas pudding the way I made it this year, in a kind of Asian fashion, I guess, or more Asian than normal. I make it in Asian fashion every year, but sometimes I'm able to get close to the English version. So here you see my pudding last year on Christmas Day, soaked in brandy and lit and looking splendid. And so this is your end product, but we're going to go back to the beginning because Sunday last was Stir Up Sunday, when you make the pudding, and let's get started on that. So now we're going to get started on the second day of making the Christmas pudding. Making Christmas puddings is a multi-layered affair, multi-day affair. You start on the first day with just the raisins in some brandy and stout, or just brandy, or just stout, or just whiskey, whichever you want. And then the next day you make up the pudding part. It's kind of like a cake mixture in a way of flour and eggs and sugar and so on, and you let that sit for 24 hours and then you steam it the next day, and then you keep it, and in my case I keep it for a year, whereas a lot of people just keep it until Christmas Day. Either way is fine. But here's the thing about keeping it for a year. I make my puddings on Stir Up Sunday, the Sunday before Advent, and I keep them for a year. And so on Christmas Day this year, I will eat the pudding I made last year on Stir Up Sunday. And what if it's really good? But I've changed the recipe this year. Then I have to wait another year before I make puddings again, before I can decide which one I like best. It gets to be a very, very long process. So this year what I'm going to do is I'm going to change out some of the ingredients from last year. You'll see, for example, I put in some chopped up walnuts. Last year I used chopped almonds. Either is acceptable, or you can leave the nuts out entirely. How will I know if the walnuts are better than the almonds? I'll know Christmas 2022, and it won't be until Stir Up Sunday of 2023 when I can make the necessary changes, which I will then eat in Christmas 2024. 2 years away. It's a complicated process, which we can shortcut a little bit by making a tiny pudding this year that I can taste this year and decide whether I like it or not, and leave the rest for the coming year. But I can make some changes next year based on the little tiny one that I ate this year. So here's our start: our fruit, brandy, stout, and nuts. And now I'm going to work in proportions of 1, 1, 1, 1 using a cup, and it's going to be 1 cup of flour, 1 cup of sugar, 1 cup of panko. Recipes often call for breadcrumbs, and in the past I have not used breadcrumbs. The cooks always say the breadcrumbs make the pudding lighter. What? I don't want a light pudding. I want a dense, heavy pudding. So I've used in the past Queen Victoria's chef recipe. His name is Francatelli, and I found his recipe once. I can't find it now, but anyway, he didn't use breadcrumbs. Very, very unusual even for Victorian times. Mrs. Beeton uses breadcrumbs. Well, I don't normally use breadcrumbs, but I'm going to be Asian this year, so I'm going to use panko, the Japanese version of breadcrumbs, and we'll see what we come up with. So 1 of flour, 1 of panko, 1 of sugar, 1 of butter, and 3 eggs. So let's get started. So I usually measure this way by putting the cup right in the pot because it means that there's less spillage. So here's 1 cup of flour, and I'm going to use Southeast Asian dark brown sugar. See, it's very dark, got a lot of molasses in it, very rich. Here's the panko, 1 cup. Now I've got the butter melting on the stove, and I'm going to first of all stir around all of these ingredients to give them a good mixing. Going to be a lot of mixing anyway, but I'm going to start by stirring these all around, just get everything all incorporated nicely, and then I'm going to add the butter and the eggs, and it's going to get rather stiff. The Victorians didn't really follow recipes very much. If you know your Christmas Carol, you know that at the Cratchit's Christmas dinner, Mrs. Cratchit is terribly worried about her pudding. She's worried about whether she put enough flour in, and I have to say that generally speaking, I've never had a pudding fall apart from lack of the right ingredients. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but now here I've got, see, this is all my dry ingredients all nicely stirred together. Now I'm going to add the melted butter and then 3 eggs. So here we go with the butter. I'm going to incorporate that. And I'm going to stir it around pretty good, and I'm going to let it sit for a little while. I don't want it to, it's a little bit warm, which is okay. But I don't want it to cook the eggs when I put them in. So I'm going to let it just settle for a little bit, and then I'm going to put the eggs in. And it will be a very, very dense mixture. And I think I've got enough for 1 big pudding, which I'll keep for a year, and then a little one, which I'll have some time in the season this year. Not Christmas Day itself necessarily, but at some point. All right, so now I have to go beat the eggs, and in a few minutes I'll incorporate them. Now for the eggs, and they're well beaten, 3 eggs. And this is the hard part. Everything is really dense and thick and hard to manipulate, but I'm going to give it a lot of stirring. This is the point where, when the chief cook has decided that it's incorporated enough, which in this case isn't going to take too long. I don't want it to be too loose. It seems okay. It seems like it's fairly damp, but not runny. It's stiff. And this is the point where you bring everybody in the family together, and each one stirs and makes a wish. So I'll make my wish now. You're not supposed to tell anyone, of course. And then I'm going to let this sit. It should ideally sit in a cool place. I don't really have a cool place to keep mine, but I'm going to let it sit for 24 hours, and then I'm going to steam it. So that will be my next step. So I'll see you tomorrow. Well, here we are on the next day, and I'm going to start steaming the puddings once I've put them into basins. I think I've got enough for 2 fairly decent sized puddings. And when I stir here, you'll see that the mixture is a little bit thicker than it was yesterday when I finished up. That's partly because the mixture has dried out a little bit, and also partly because I wasn't really happy with how wet it was, and so I added another half a cup of flour. And then as I was stirring, I kept thinking, this doesn't have the aroma that it usually has. What's the problem? And of course realized that I hadn't put any spices in at all. Somehow or other I'd missed that piece out. I put a lot in my mincemeat, hadn't put any in the Christmas pudding, so of course I had to get out the ginger, nutmeg, cinnamon, allspice, cloves, and dump in a fair amount of each and stir it all around. So now we are at the point where I can start steaming. I'm going to put these into probably 2 basins, I'll see, and then steam for about 6 to 8 hours. It all depends on how long I feel like staring at a boiling pot. Now, the first task you can see here is to line a basin. This is a metal basin. I'm lining it with aluminium foil, although this is not the preferred method by most people. And I used to use cheesecloth rather than foil, but I can't get cheesecloth here. The absolutely traditional way is to make a kind of cannonball in a cheesecloth out of the pudding mix, and let the cannonball roll around in boiling water for 5 or 6 hours on Christmas Day. That's how Mrs. Cratchit did it in the Christmas Carol. I'm going to steam in aluminum, and what's going to happen is I'm going to steam this for 6 to 8 hours, and then I'm going to remove the foil that I've steamed it in and wrap it instead in some kind of cling wrap, because I'm going to soak it in brandy. But let's get started now with filling the basin up with the pudding. And it's a bit of a job, so I'm not going to keep you watching it the whole time, but I'll get you started. It's very, very thick and heavy, and you just plonk it in, and And with the spices in there now, it does smell nice and rich and festive. I'm beginning to feel the Christmas spirit, not the fake Christmas spirit of the malls and all of that, but the Christmas spirit of my family experience going back to my childhood. So going back over 60 years when my mother used to do this, and then when I had my own family, I picked up the gauntlet, and I've been doing it now for at least, at least 45 years. So there's the finished pudding that's going to go in the steamer. I'm gonna make a smaller one and put them both in together, and I'll show you the steaming. So here you can see the pot that I just filled with the foil tucked over completely and making a good seal so that the steam and boiling water doesn't get inside with the pudding. And now I'm going to fill another bowl and add it to the top. I need to find a way to put a rack in there or something, and then I'm going to start steaming. Well, I ended up deciding to completely construct my Chinese steamer, so I've got the second pudding in the top, and I think what may happen is that I'll have my pudding from last year for Christmas Day, but I may have parts of this one, the smaller one, afterwards and see how that recipe works out. Not sure yet. Anyway, going to put the lid on and steam away for 6 to 8 hours. Here we are, about 2 hours in. Everything's steaming along just nicely. Just have to keep an eye on the water level every hour or so just to make sure it doesn't boil dry. Everything's doing fine. I'm using my electric induction burner that I got last year for Christmas to try and save on gas, because 8 hours of cooking on gas is going to be pretty brutal, but this works out fine, and the electricity is not that expensive. Alright, so here we have the proof of the pudding. I left it in for about 7 hours in total for a couple of reasons. One being that the induction burner switched off when I was away, and it was probably not off for very long, but I decided to just give it an extra hour, and you can see it's now all nice and rich and dark. It smells beautiful. I just took it out of its container and took the foil off the top just to see how things were, because if it hadn't cooked enough I would have kept it going, but of course it is. So now I'm going to let it cool. I'm going to take the other one out, and then I'm going to put them in zip top bags and pour in some brandy, and then just let them marinate from now until next year for the big one. But for this year, for this one, it's just a little one. I don't know when I'm going to get to it, because I've got a big pudding from last year for this Christmas, so it may be well after New Year before I start moving into this one and getting bigger set of trousers to wear. I don't know. But anyway, this is the cooked pudding ready to go into the brandy. Alright, so just to complete the story, here's the second one on the right, a little bit bigger. Both of them have rather gnarly tops to them. I'm going to probably trim them a little bit before I cook them down for Christmas Day itself. I'm not sure. I'm going to be by myself. The only thing is that when I light them with brandy, they have to be able to sit nicely on the plate. The bottoms, which you can't see here, are all nicely rounded. they're the bottoms now, but I will invert them so that they will be the top, and they'll have brandy and it'll be lit and everything, and that's fine, but they won't sit very nicely unless the what is the top now, which would become the bottom, is trimmed, which will be fine. I've already had a little taste of the small one. It tastes fine. It needs to mature. Definitely young. Has a young flavor, sort of like a young wine. When it sits in brandy for a month or a year, it'll become much, much, much richer. So here we are at the end game of Stir Up Sunday. Got 2 puddings in bags, and you can see here that I put the brandy in with the puddings. I'm going to let them mature now, and the mincemeat continues to mature. So I hope you have a good week, and on Friday I'm going to start thinking about an Advent wreath, because Sunday is the first Sunday of Advent. That's next Sunday. So have a good week.